Through funding through the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, we engaged IFA to write the theological reflection for the beginning of our document. You'll be able to read the whole document online. It's available actually by hard copy through the Bishops' Conference still, but it's also free online. But IFA put together the underpinning of what lay pastoral ministry is and what it could be. Basically, of course, coming from our baptismal call. From there, we developed some resources that would be helpful, particularly for smaller dioceses that don't have their own HR departments or don't know where to start when writing a contract and agreement for lay pastoral ministers, or for lay pastoral ministers themselves as they've been approached, as often happens by a parish priest. Would you do such and such? Would you run the RCIA in my parish? Oh, yes. What does that entail? So then those negotiations of, is it voluntary? Is it part-time? Is it paid? What are the supports around someone who's going to lead a program like that? So we put some resources into that to think about, just to allow people to, as they're beginning their journey as lay pastoral ministers, or if they've hit a stumbling block in their journey as lay pastoral ministers, to have some ideas around how they can approach all these matters of employment, voluntary contract, rights and responsibilities. Plus the workplace health and safety of lay pastoral ministers, the safety of their personal working. Many of us know that lay pastoral ministers work incredibly hard, do a lot of overtime, often unrecognised, certainly unrewarded. And so all those sort of things we put as resources in the index, appendix, just as ideas, just as resources, knowing that each diocese would do it differently. Richard, the next step was to get the bishops to endorse our project.
Yeah, so we had done this work, obviously, with the guidelines. There'd been a prior step too, which I think the bishops were very pleased about, that Dr. Aoife McGrath also had done some research in Australia around a number of parishes and the role of pastoral associates there, from remote communities through to urban centres. So this became a strong basis of, I suppose, that Aoife was able to draw upon when she went to look at best practice. It was very much grounded in our context. The other thing that the bishops were very keen to see was that we had looked at the past and present reality of the story of Australia. So that and that was really the council's work. Aoife McGrath couldn't actually write our own story. She left that for us, which made a lot of sense. So we did quite a lot of work putting together the history all the way, really recognising the First Nation people and their own experience of the Spirit, and then so we touched on that, and then we moved through, of course, to the first fleet arrival and the experience in the early days where there were just no clergy, no ordained people, and how the church expressed itself in that time, with obviously all lay pastoral ministers operating early on. So we tracked that story through. So you'll see that in chapter 1. And Aoife then covered those other areas, which the bishops were very keen to see, the reality, that complex reality of chapter 2 that talks about all the things that Kari was mentioning. We tried to capture the complexity of language, and the bishops were keen to see that was fully sort of recognised there, as well as the many issues. What was important at that point, and part of our discussion with the bishops, was the collaboration between the ordained and the lay, and that there certainly was, just as we wanted that to be a very creative, healthy relationship. And so the document touches on that at different points about understanding how those roles complement one another. and that lay pastoral ministry and ordained ministry can certainly work hand in hand, as we know they do in many settings. The document, as we know, then talked about best practice, and it was the end of the document, though, you'll see a bunch of recommendations. They're very important because they spell out what the direction, I suppose, of the guidelines points to. So this is every diocese, every community in a sense is asked to pick up those recommendations, use them as a kind of checklist to say, well, how is this being expressed in our local reality? And again, all this was endorsed by the bishops. They had a big look through and had lots of pen strokes and marks that they wanted us to revise, and until we could finally launch the document, which we're able to do in Proclaim in Brisbane a few years ago. And so that's been a terrific, of course, step in the journey to have the document launched. And I'll let Kari just share a little bit about, I suppose, what our hopes are for the future.
Thank you. One thing, our hope is not that the document will sit on a shelf somewhere and be forgotten. It needs to be dusted off and looked at. And as Richard said, the recommendations are clear and a great starting point for conversations, both within dioceses and within parish communities, particularly parish communities that either have or are looking at appointing a lay pastoral ministry. It was a recognition, and I think that recognition, I'm hoping greatly that the Plenary Council will pick up this idea of lay people ministering alongside ordained. We know our church is richer, and for this, we know it's much poorer when we don't have this co-responsible church. It's a great opportunity and it's a great challenge. So that we were very grateful that the bishops did take up our invitation and our push to have national guidelines, and we're now keen that they keep being developed and rolled out, as it were, across the country. Again, it's very hard in this vast land of ours for people to even know things exist, and I know we've all experienced that. That's why people like yourselves today, who are interested, perhaps involved with lay pastoral ministry, need to be you're part of this story, because your story is part of our national guidelines for lay pastoral ministry. So while we're very grateful that the bishops took this up and took it seriously, we also need people to continue to take it seriously. That you go to the bishops' conference and website and find the national guidelines, that you seek them out, that you ask help from the National Lay Pastoral Ministers Network that's around now, that Richard is part of, and that you keep the conversations going. Find the document. It's called Faithful Stewards of God's Grace. And our hope and our prayer is that our document will be a document that will encourage each of us and the people who are to come, the lay pastoral ministers who are to come, to be that faithful stewards of God's grace.